Well, this morning we are actually celebrating a couple of holidays. The first of those is Juneteenth. Juneteenth is the day, June 19th, where we celebrate June 19th, 1865. And we celebrate that as the day that enslaved Black Americans actually began to experience the liberation that was intended in the Emancipation Proclamation. We know that that was given, obviously, in 1863. But in areas that were Confederate controlled, it was difficult to enforce that. And so June 19th, 1865 is the day that Union troops rode into Galveston Bay, Texas, and announced the enforcement of this proclamation. This is celebrated as a sort of second Independence Day because as great as the first Independence Day was, it did not mean freedom for all Americans. And so we celebrate that day on June 19th each year. And as a church, recognizing that as a nation, we are still reeling from this legacy of slavery. We are still doing the work of healing from this legacy. We feel as though the church has a major responsibility in doing this work. And so hopefully this is not new information to anyone, but is a church that is continuing to do the work of being a multi-ethnic church. We have brought together a small team of people who is actually going to help us begin to do the work of assessing all of our ministries, all of our events, generally how we tend to approach things, and to assess them in particular for any obstacles to racial, ethnic, or socioeconomic diversity that as a predominantly white middle-class church we would not see for ourselves. And so this team is made up of, there are 3 of us who identify as white, 2 of us who identify as mixed, and 1 as black. And so having a diverse team to help us evaluate all of these things. And so as this team has been coming together, we've been thinking about beginning in a place of, what's the baseline? What is people's experience of racial and ethnic diversity at Bright City and socioeconomic diversity at Bright City currently, kind of to get a baseline of things. And so rather than us sort of as 6 people speculating about this, we have done the work of putting together a survey that we would like to invite everyone in our church to fill out, regardless of race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status. We want to invite you to fill this out in order for us to get a clear picture, not only of numerically where we are, but more importantly, what people's experience of Bright City is. And so we have a QR code here. I want to invite you to pull your phone out in church and click this QR code, pull it up, go ahead and have that on your phone. We also have put that in our Friday newsletter, so some of you have already gone in and completed that. Thank you so much for being willing to do that. And it's an anonymous survey, and the big part of it being anonymous is we want to create as safe of a place for honesty as possible. And so really appreciate you contributing in that way. The other thing that we wanted to share with you is knowing that this has been a part of our heart as a church for a long time. One of the hard things about being a leader, casting a vision, is that it's not yet the reality. And so for us to communicate, hey, this is an important thing for us, and yet our congregation doesn't really reflect that. There's a level of humbling in that. But wanted to provide a resource for you guys as the church to maybe develop a clearer sense of why this is a part of our vision. And so at brightcitychurch.com/racial unity, we've put together a list of some of our sermons around this conversation. And if you want to know more about sort of the New Testament vision for the multi-ethnic church, or Jesus's care for the marginalized, or other related conversations, I want to invite you to check out that website. There's stuff about Be the Bridge there as well, but we do all of that in celebration of Juneteenth together as a community. The other day that we celebrate today is Father's Day, and so we want to take a moment to say Happy Father's Day to the dads out there. We are grateful for you. I know we've done this once, but can we give a hand to the fathers, to the dads? Love you. We are so grateful for you and for your service and just your sacrifice. I really believe that there is a generation of fathers coming up right now that is really showing up for their kids in maybe a way that's never been before. I think I shared this statistic last year, but recent statistics are showing that present-day dads are spending 7 times as much time with their children interacting on a daily basis than fathers 40 or 50 years ago. And so just incredible steps in the right direction. However, I do need to be clear, when it comes to this statistic, the average of a father that's working, spends with his kids, is 35 minutes a day. That's up from 5 minutes a day in 1974, okay? So we got a long way to go. A lot of work to be done. But still, I think that there is a movement in the right direction. At the same time, I want to acknowledge that Father's Day is a complicated day. It is a difficult day that, yes, there are many of us who are blessed with a good father and a good relationship with that father, and to still have that father with us, but also recognizing there are many of us who have a complicated or broken relationship with a father. Maybe we've lost our father. There's also many of us who maybe long to be fathers, but for many painful reasons have not been able to. And so just want to acknowledge and create space for the complexity of this day that comes with it, even as we celebrate. And so this morning, I wanted to spend some time speaking to the complicated nature of this day and to speak to it under the heading of Resurrecting Fatherhood. My thinking here, I want to speak first to the fathers in the room who maybe have a broken relationship with their children. And the reason I want to begin there is because I think as fathers, there are many reasons that we maybe have broken or painful relationships with our children. And yet I feel that the onus is on us as fathers to be the ones doing the hard work, to do everything we can in our power to heal those relationships. Recognizing we only have so much control over that relationship, but we should carry the burden of doing that work. I also want to speak then after that with those who have broken relationships with their fathers or their parents. How do we face today? How do we think about a day like today? And so as we get into this, I think there's a lot in here for maybe those of us who aren't fathers or those of us who are fathers with good relationships with our kids. There's a lot that I want to talk about that pertains to how do we prevent breaking relationships. But I want to drill in on this challenge of broken relationships. One of the things that I hear a lot when it comes to this conversation is it's too late. Or too much damage has been done. There's too much work to be done. It can't be done. And the premise that I want to operate under as we talk about this morning is understanding that a part of the power of the message of Jesus is that Jesus' greatest victory, the resurrection, did not occur until after his death. And so part of what that means for us is that it's never too late to begin our story of redemption. It's never too late for us to begin doing this kind of work. And so the question I'm asking is, what do we learn from Jesus' resurrection about resurrecting fatherhood, resurrecting our fatherhood in particular? Let me set this up, give you some context of how I'm framing this conversation. When you think about Jesus and his disciples and the relationship that he had formed with them over the 3 years of ministry that he had done, there had been immense trust that was built. But there were also certain assumptions that the disciples had made about Jesus, about what it meant for Jesus to be the Savior, about how he would save the world. And so when Jesus was crucified and died, though Jesus had done nothing wrong, it did disrupt that relationship with the disciples. It disrupted or problematized their trust in him. Because what they thought he was going to do is not what ended up happening. That trust was interrupted. And when it comes to broken relationships, a major part of healing those relationships is rebuilding trust. And the thing that I want to communicate when it comes to resurrecting these kinds of relationships is understanding, first of all, that rebuilding trust requires consistent action over time. Building trust itself requires consistent action over time, but when it comes to rebuilding trust, it's even more important that there's consistent action over time. Let me kind of paint this picture for you a little bit. Our family goes to a pool where there is a large slide, and there's steps up to the top of the slide, and it kind of swirls down. It's a little intimidating if you're a young kid. And so with each of our kids, there's kind of been this build-up to them going down the slide for the first time. And I don't remember which one of our kids this was, but I remember them being really, really scared of going down the slide for the first time. And it's one of those moments where you just have to leverage all of their trust in you. And so you're like, I promise I will catch you. Like, you have nothing to worry about. I promise I will catch you. You will be fine. And so the way that we do this is Sharon would go to the top of the slide up with them, and I would be at the bottom to catch them when they come out of the slide. So that's what we did. Sharon went up to the top of the slide with them, sent them down the slide, and as I'm waiting for him to come down, someone yells behind me and says, "Hey, Ike." And I turn around, and it's someone I haven't seen in like 15 years. And so I'm like, "Oh my goodness!" And our child just slides straight into the water. Under the water, so I run over, I scoop him up, and I'm like, I am so sorry. I am so sorry. And you're like, trust destroyed. Like, I will never go down this slide again, right? So after, I don't remember if it was like weeks, months, years, at some point, we convinced the child to go on this again. And this is the moment where, this is game time. Like, no distractions, earplugs in, fully focused, right? And they come down, you catch them, and it's the first spark of new trust, right? But every time they come down, you've got to be right there. Because every time that you catch them, it rebuilds that trust a little bit more and a little bit more. And it didn't matter if I told him 1,000 times, hey, you can trust me. It's not until he actually experiences that consistent action that trust will begin to build. Jesus, in the same way, had to rebuild trust with his disciples to repair their trust in him. And so in Acts chapter 1, we see it says this: after he had suffered, he presented himself alive to them by many convincing proofs, appearing to them over a period of 40 days and speaking about the kingdom of God. He didn't just show up one time and say, okay, guys, everything's good. It was repeatedly over a period of 40 days. And one of the scenes that we get after the resurrection is that Jesus meets with his disciples in the upper room, but Thomas, one of the disciples, is not with them. And so we get this account of Thomas eventually meeting the resurrected Jesus in John 20. It says, but Thomas, called Twin, one of the 12, was not with them when Jesus came. So the other disciples were telling him, we've seen the Lord. But he said to them, if I don't see the mark of the nails in his hands, put my finger into the mark of the nails, and put my hand into his side, I will never believe. A week later, his disciples were indoors again, and Thomas was with them. Even though the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, peace be with you. Then he said to Thomas, put your finger here and look at my hands. Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Don't be faithless, but believe. Thomas responded to him, my Lord and my God. I think this is such a powerful story when it comes to this conversation, because I think we can all envision, whether we've seen it in a movie or seen it in our own lives or the lives of our friends, where a father has promised to show up for their kid, promised to be there. And that being disappointed enough, they reach a point where, yeah, I'll believe it when I see it. I'll believe it when it actually happens, right? That was the mentality of Thomas. I'll believe it when I see it. And maybe there's a stretch here in this metaphor, this comparison, but I want it to be clear. One of the things that's so important for us to understand when it comes to rebuilding trust is that Jesus did not grow impatient when they struggled to have that trust again. He did not punish them for asking for what they needed in order to believe. And I think oftentimes when we are the offending party, when we are the one that has broken the trust, I think we tend to think that trust should be gained faster than it can be. And so what we see with Jesus and that we've got to learn is understanding that it cost me nothing to ask you to trust me again. It cost you a lot to put yourself in a place of vulnerability, to trust again. The second thing that we can do towards resurrecting these relationships is doing the painful and hard thing in the short term. Doing the painful and hard thing in the short term. From Jesus' perspective, the good thing about the resurrection, right, is that he didn't stay dead. The bad thing is he had to die in the first place. And I think when it comes to resurrecting our relationships, I think many of us want resurrection in our relationships, but we don't want to have to die in the first place. We don't want to have to own up to the things that we've done that have contributed to the brokenness of the relationship. But Jesus understood this. In John 12, he said, "Truly I tell you, unless a grain of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it remains by itself. But if it dies, it produces much fruit." The phrase in there that captured my mind was this: it remains by itself. I'm wondering how many of us, in the desire to protect our pride and our ego, have insisted on that ego and that pride to the point of breaking a relationship, being by ourselves, rather than dying to ourselves, owning our mistakes so that we can bear fruit in the relationship. And so insofar as we have contributed to the deterioration of a relationship, oftentimes we've exacerbated the pain of the brokenness because we were trying to protect some pain in us or protect ourselves from some pain. But the truth is, if there's going to be healing in the relationship, it's going to be painful in the short term. The longer that we allow that pain to remain there, the worse it gets. It's like a financial investment that builds interest over time and compounds interest, right? The longer it's there, the more that sum of money gets. The same with our pain. The longer it's allowed to just sit there, the worse and worse it gets. And so maybe another way of bringing this home is to think about it like a growth in our body that we allow to stay because we're too afraid of the surgery. But by refusing to do the thing that in the short term is painful, we are actually perpetuating the long-term pain. And so I want to ask you this morning, what is the painful thing as you think about that relationship, whatever relationship it is that's coming to mind for you, whether you're a father or not? Maybe it's with a spouse, maybe it's with a child, maybe it's a coworker, a friend. What is the hard thing that you need to do in the short term to bring about the long-term healing? And then finally, the third thing, something that a pastor friend of mine has said a lot, is playing the tape forward. One of the things that we learn from Jesus as he faced his crucifixion and ultimately the resurrection is how to play the tape forward. And what I mean by that is when you play this current event, this current situation, this current relationship forward, how do you want the story to be told? What do you want the story to be that is told? In John 12, Jesus is agonizing over the cross, and he says this, "Now my soul is troubled. What should I say? Father, save me from this hour. But that is why I came to this hour. Father, glorify your name." Then a voice came from heaven, "I have glorified it, and I will glorify it again." We see Jesus wrestling with himself about the pain that is coming. And essentially asking, okay, is the story going to be I bailed at the last minute? Is the story going to be I got too scared and ran? And what we hear Jesus say is no. This is the reason I am here. The story is going to be that I glorified his name. And I want to ask you, what's the story that you want to be told? How do you want this to play out when it's all over with? One of the things when it comes to our relationship with our children is the demand of our attention. That there's so many things demanding our attention, whether that's our jobs, our screens, social media, friendships, all kinds of things, some good, some bad, some neutral, but there's a demand for our attention that's always competing with our children having our attention. And so a common one, obviously, is the demand of work. And so we may find ourselves often in that position of, okay, will I choose the pressure at work because the consequences are more immediate and apparent? Following Jesus, we might say, no, this is the reason I am here. To tell my child, so that my child knows that there is someone who loves them more than their career, their screens, their social media, whatever it may be. This is the reason I am here. But I want to acknowledge that's much easier said than done. Sometimes in the weeds of day-to-day life, it can be difficult to know, how do I prioritize? Or what do I prioritize? What is the most important thing for this moment? Do I need to prioritize work, or prioritize this relationship, or prioritize this relationship, or prioritize my child and my attention to them? To kind of paint the picture for you a little bit of why kind of zooming out can help by playing it forward. Several years ago, back in 2010, Sharon and I had an invite to go and spend some time in Dubai with some missionary friends of ours who were serving in Afghanistan at the time. And so they were coming for some vacation time. We met them there in Dubai. And this was just after they had finished building the Burj Khalifa, right? The world's tallest building. And so we're there and seeing this building. And one of the interesting things about this, if you've ever been to, Chicago and Willis Tower, Sears Tower, however you want to think of it, when you are in the city and you're looking up, sometimes it can be hard to tell just how tall some of these buildings are. Right? The vantage point is difficult to see, to the point where sometimes you're like, is that the tallest building, or is that actually the tallest building? And so when we're in Dubai, we're like, okay, it's a large building, but when you're like looking up at all these buildings, it's hard to tell exactly how tall. So I've got a picture to show you. So you can see the tall building there in the middle, the Burj Khalifa, but you're kind of at this low angle, and so it's hard to tell exactly like how tall it is. You can tell like it's taller than the others, but you're like, it's not that tall, right? Well, on our trip there, we did something called a desert safari, where you get into these four-wheel drive vehicles, you go out into the desert, you basically surf the dunes in these vehicles, but we drive outside of the city, and when you look back at the city, this is what you see. You're like, oh, it is a bit taller, like twice as tall, maybe 3 times as tall. Right? So getting outside, zooming out, gives you a clearer picture of what the highest building is. Not only what the highest, but exactly how high it is. And I think as parents, as fathers, sometimes we've got to play the tape forward. We've got to zoom out from the immediacy of the moment so that we can be reminded, so we can see with greater clarity, what is the highest priority in this moment. Playing the tape forward allows us to do that work. Well, how about those of us who have that broken relationship with a father? How do I think about today? How should I think about today? I think I've shared a little bit of my story with you all, but my father passed away almost 17 years ago now, and so this day is complicated because on the one hand, a lot of that pain feels pretty distant. It feels kind of far away, and I know that in spite of my father's own pain and struggles, in a lot of ways he did his best to love me well. And yet I also know that I want to be a very different kind of father than he was. And so one of the things that helps me on Father's Day is that I often view this day as much about renewing my commitment to being the kind of father deep down I know I want to be, as it is about remembering my father or even being celebrated as a father. And so that's one of the ways that I go about this day, is a day of recommitting myself to that work. But I know that doesn't work for everyone, and I realize not all of us in here are fathers or parents. And so maybe if that's you, I want to say, first of all, I think that there is a really important place to create space for grief. Giving yourself the space to grieve what was lost, to grieve maybe what never existed, to give a space for that pain to find a path to the surface of our lives, because until it finds that place, that path to the surface, it will wreak havoc below the surface of our lives. But the second thing I want to say comes from a quote from C.S. Lewis, and I don't have this on a slide, but C.S. Lewis once said, if we find ourselves with a desire that nothing in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that we were created for a different world. And his point in that was making the argument that these desires maybe that we don't know what to do with, or that there's nothing in the world that ultimately satisfies them. We shouldn't just pretend like we don't have them, but let that lead us to understand maybe this isn't the world we were created for. Maybe we were created for something more. And I think there's a similar idea when it comes to fathers. That we have that desire for that good father or that perfect father. And the fact is, none of us have that perfect father. But I wonder if there's something to that desire for that perfect father that draws us to the reminder of the only one who can fulfill that desire ultimately. To let that draw us into ever deeper, more meaningful relationship with him. And I don't mean for that to sound trite. I think sometimes we can hear that and we say, okay, I just need to remember I have an eternal father. That's not all that I'm saying. Several years ago, Keith Urban shared a little bit about his own struggle with alcoholism. And one of the things that he shared was that in his sobriety and in his recovery, one of the things that he valued most and was enjoying most was his ability to be more present to his kids. And I remember hearing that and not understanding what he meant by that. But coming to have my own kids and understanding that I think one of the greatest gifts that I can give to my own children is my attention that is fully focused, unfractured, undivided, fully focused on them. And the reason I say that is because I think we quickly move past the truth that we do have a God, a Father in heaven, who is prepared to give us that fully focused, unfractured, undivided attention and presence. And I think in our attempts at times to numb whatever pain we feel, to distract ourselves from the moment, we don't give ourselves even the time to experience his presence that is just waiting for us. And so I want to invite us to do that right now. I want to invite you to bow your heads, to close your eyes, to just make yourself present to the presence of God with you. Maybe it's helpful to paint the picture of a father with his arms wide. No distractions, nothing else demanding his attention, just simply craving you to come and to be in his presence, to experience the peace of his presence, the delight of his presence, the satisfaction of his presence, knowing that if we are with him, we have everything that we need. If you're here this morning and you need someone to pray with you, we have our prayer team available. on each side. But I just want to invite you to sit in this space for a moment, to be reminded of God's presence and his desire, his eager desire for you to come and be with him.